Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on Mercote, Marsh and Fosse. And it's one of a few webinars we're doing this week as part of our Heritage Open Days series. So you might be interested in looking at some of our other webinars. So I'm Natasha and I work at Wessex Archaeology. I'll also be joined by a colleague from AOC Archaeology, part of Connect as well today. And these companies are both commercial archaeology companies. And that means that we do archaeology before development happens. So that can be kind of desk-based assessments, trial trenching, or it can be full-scale excavation works. So today, where we're looking at, it's going to be developed as part of HS2. So some of the other webinars later on, you might have seen Park Street yesterday, and we've got Coles Hill tomorrow. But today we're looking at Mercote, Marsh and Fosse. So today I'm joined by Helen Shittock from AOC Archaeology, part of Connect, and Emma Carter from Wessex Archaeology. Hello, Emma.
Hello.
Hello, Helen.
Hi.
So you'll be seeing Emma and Helen throughout the webinar. They'll pop up at different points. So before I hand you over to Emma for the start of the webinar, just to say this webinar will discuss human remains and a fragment of a human femur will also be shown during the webinar. Right, over to you, Emma.
Thanks very much. It's not too grisly with the human femur, but it is worth letting you know. So good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar today. Like Tess said, I'm Emma Carter, and I'm a commercial archaeologist for Wessex Archaeology. So throughout our excavations along the route of HS2, we've been able to build upon our knowledge of Iron Age people and their lives. The Iron Age in Britain spanned from 700 BC to 43 AD, and through our excavations, we have uncovered basically what was left behind. So from those tiny seas to perhaps larger fragments like quernstone, so that's used for grinding grains, even things like butchered animal bones, ring gullies, all these pieces of archaeological evidence help build up a picture of the past. So we find the rubbish that people left behind nearly 2 millennia ago, that bin broken bowl, the remains of dinner, bead from a broken necklace maybe, or the bones of slaughtered animals. But sometimes we also find more deliberate deposits that softly whisper tantalizing possibilities surrounding ritual and death. And through the excavations of Fosse and Mercote Marsh, we'll be uncovering the lifetime of a settlement. We'll also see how finding human bones in the foundation of a roundhouse is not quite as uncommon as we might initially think. So the first thing that we can see in this picture here is the mud. We can't escape it. So there's a lot of mud and rain on site at Fosse, and that's partly due to the site's natural geological substrate. And that is red clay. So the natural on this site is red clay, and clay, as we know, is great at keeping the land waterlogged when it rains. So just as the team of archaeologists on site would have struggled in the slip mud when it rained, it's pretty likely that the people living in our small Iron Age settlement would have experienced similar effects when the weather wasn't so great. Now, both the features we can see here are associated with the two structures as part of that settlement, and we're going to reveal a bit more information later on. Now, but with those structures, we also have roundhouses, so that's what they probably are, and also enclosures. Now, enclosures can be any shape and use ditches, banks, or even fencing to separate one area of land from the other. Enclosures can also be used around cemeteries, domestic dwellings. They can be used to contain animals or keep animals out of a place. They also can be places of ritual and even fortification. So an enclosure can be many, many things in archaeology. So enclosure 1, which is what we have on site, wasn't fully revealed during the mitigation. However, if the results of the geophysical survey are accurate, this is just a small enclosure, orientated almost directly north and south, and pretty much sub-rectangular in form, although it did have rounded corners. It was approximately 26 metres long and 18 metres wide, and all the slots excavated through the ditch produced finds, mainly abraded, so worn down mid to late Iron Age potsherds, which Helen will be taking us through a bit later. Also some fragments and evidence of animal bone also. On the eastern side of the enclosure, the ditch had been recut, and that's probably due to, we think, to a localised silting event. So that basically means that the edges of the ditch, perhaps there was a lot of water that day and they're silted in, and that's why the ditch then had to be redug. So much like how you get farmers redigging the sides of dikes on local roads in the countryside, similar sort of thing, but to stop the animals getting in or out. In the recut, there's also a large quantity again of mid to late Iron Age pottery, so it does suggest that from this point the enclosure is in use during a set period of time. Now, within that recut slot that was excavated, there were several fragments from a single vessel, and this may actually imply that prior to truncation, a complete vessel had been placed as part of a deliberate deposit, perhaps hinting at activities of more of a ritual nature.
I have a quick question, Emma, about this picture as well. So when we're looking at this, how do archaeologists know this to be a feature? How do they know when to stop digging?
It's a really good question because it looks like different shades of brown, doesn't it? Brown and red. So what's interesting about this feature, and hopefully will help answer the question, is the profile. So we can look where those the red scale bars are. So if you want to figure out what an archaeologist is taking a picture of, look for the scale bars, and that's the clue. So we might be able to see from here, as Tasha's pointing out, where the scale bars are, we've got a change of soil colour. So the natural substrate is that red clay, sort of a brownish red. And then in the section, so where the sort of the profile of the feature is, we can see it's a different colour, and it's kind of a sort of a dark greyish colour to it. So we're looking at the distinction between the natural geology and then the fill of a feature. And the fill of a feature is basically how the shape of it got filled up with stuff. And that could be due to silting, as we've alluded to, or perhaps it was deliberately backfilled in something like a rubbish pit. But in this feature here, we know it's the enclosure ditch, and the profile of it is really important. On that steep side, that will basically means that things can't crawl out, but then the step side does mean that if something does fall in, it's got one way to go in and one way to go out. So if you're keeping goats, for example, they're pretty naughty, they can get anywhere, or sheep actually as well, you would be able to limit them in that enclosure even if they could jump over the fence. So it's a good question, Tash.
That's very clever.
Now, the results that we'll go on to look at Fosse, I think are really, really interesting. So we can see here we've got two sort of roundish shapes, so structure 1 and structure 2. I think the little footnotes on this illustration are quite useful in getting your eye in. So these two structures, we think that they are the round houses, and then the enclosure is down towards the bottom of that map. We see enclosure 1 there with those nice round edges. And do bear in mind as well that the green lines you can see, they're not previous trenches, they're actually medieval furrow. But we're not looking at the medieval period just yet, so we'll forget that for now and focus on the lovely enclosures and the Iron Age results here on site. So one thing that's important to note is that the enclosure did not form an element of a more extensive set of enclosures or a larger field system. It was isolated and discrete. So that's important. If you go, again, we use the current agriculture and farming landscape as an example. If you go out to the countryside, you'll see lots of parcels of field and land, and you may see, and they may be counted as enclosures if they're walled in. This site doesn't have that, so it is isolated. So this is perhaps slightly unusual, as enclosures do tend to be integrated into more complex networks of ditch systems. And there are actually only a few parallels for this feature are known in the Iron Age period, but there is a similar one that was excavated in the Arrow Valley in Warwickshire. And in this instance, it was identified as a small stock enclosure. So these pieces of evidence help kind of support our interpretation so far. Now, the absence of internal features could also imply that enclosure 1 was a livestock enclosure, perhaps to corral sheep or herd cattle, as we've seen from the profile. However, in general, the ditch fields or stock enclosures are relatively sterile and only tend to contain small quantities of material culture, because it's unlikely that you're going to be hanging out with perhaps the goats and the sheep and the cattle whilst having lovely pottery vessels. So the fields of enclosure 1 were actually really fines rich, and the quantities of pottery and animal bone recovered from all the slots excavated through the ditches was quite high in comparison. So as all the cut features on the site were heavily truncated, so basically later modern agriculture comes in and ploughs it out. The fact that they contain finds at all is even more significant and actually implies that the domestic activities undertaken at this site may have been short-lived but potentially intensive in nature. It is possible that this small enclosure functioned for other reasons beyond controlling livestock. So the presence of assemblages of animal bone and pottery in the silted ditch sections could feasibly have ended up there as a result of material perhaps washing down the slope from the two roundhouses, that's more towards the northeast, and hence be indicative of activities of a more practical nature. However, the limited paleo-environmental evidence remains, such as cereal grains, things like that, that were recovered where present, were very, very abraded. So it's suggesting that some domestic activity was present within the area, but this is probably not extensive. It's also worth noting that a flint blade from one of the ditches was of an early Neolithic date, and although residual, so it has come in there by accident, it does imply a background presence of earlier prehistoric activity in the wider landscape. So through excavation and environmental assessment, we can begin to build a picture of how the settlement might have looked. And in this reconstruction, we're looking at structure 1 and structure 2. So that's the main, so the thatch buildings. So structure 1 is the bigger, more rounder, lower one, and structure 2, one with a more pointed roof. So it's worth noting as well that structure 1 is one of the interpretations that we've got. I might show you another one a bit later. So we can also begin to see the enclosure fence dividing up the land. So it's perhaps we can imagine that that fence there was to keep out some of the more rambunctious sheep or goats. Now, the second view, if you go on to the next slide, please, shows more of the enclosure. And I can also point out where the very interesting human bones were found. So if you look at structure 2 on the right, and we can perhaps just pick out the entrance. And so the entrance is just lower down there, and it's not quite that pit hash, but if you go more towards the left, see where those numbers are pointing out?
Down
I've
here?
not quite got it there. It's back on to the roundhouse and just to the right of the entrance. So that's where the human... yes, just around there.
To the right,
so,
here?
Yes, spot on. And so that was found within the ditch of the roundhouse itself. Now, to discuss a little bit more about those human bones, we're going to go on to Helen.
Thank you very much, Emma. Yeah, I'm going to be talking through a few of the finds today. And first of all, I'd like to talk about the interesting human bone that Emma's been mentioning, found within structure 2. Now, if we could move on to the next slide, I believe there's a picture there. Yeah, lovely. So the bone in the image there is part of a human femur, and that's a thigh bone, along with other associated fragments from the same bone, all excavated from this gully around structure 2. All the finds we're talking about today have been assessed by archaeological find specialists. The bone from the site was examined by archaeozoologist Matilda Holmes, and this human bone has also been just briefly looked at by one of our resident human osteologists at AOC, Mara Tesserieri. So you can see in the photograph there's a large bone and a number of smaller fragments. And what you're looking at with the large bone is the top part of the left femur, and we're looking at it from the back as well. Osteologists can sometimes tell the age of an individual from their bones. A lot of the characteristics that osteologists would use and would look for in a femur like this are found at the proximal and distal extremities. That's the ends of the bone. And you can see from the photo that those ends are largely missing. However, from the size of the femur, it can be said that it might belong to someone who was adolescent or older. That's still quite a broad range, but obviously really helpful in helping us to sort of reconstruct who this person might be. People watching this might be wondering about how and why fragments of human bone have ended up in a gully surrounding a roundhouse structure. But it's really important to note that people in Iron Age Britain often treated their dead in ways that are very different from the funerary practices we have in Britain today. So during most of the Iron Age, burying whole bodies in graves was very rare. Cremations occurred at certain times in certain places, but it's thought that some funerary traditions may have involved something called excarnation, that is, leaving bodies out in the open until all the soft tissue has gone. And it's also possible that human remains were redeposited multiple times. So the bones that remain from these kinds of processes are often fragmented and deposited in places such as houses, ditches, and pits. So really, finding this femur in the roundhouse structure is really exciting for us, but it's not actually that weird for the Iron Age. So it's great that this site's obviously fitting into those wider Iron Age traditions.
Absolutely, and to kind of further reinforce the oddness of perhaps burial practices in the Iron Age, we can look at another site that's actually quite similar and is just, I think, it's approximately 6 kilometres away. So this site is Cubbington Woods. Cubbington Woods is a really interesting site because, much like Fosse, we also had deposits of human bone in the roundhouse. So what are they doing? So let's have a little bit more of a closer look about what's going on in this picture. So these penannular or ring ditches, they are again believed to represent the eaves drip gullies. So that's the basically like the drainage area that forms. Imagine you've got a roundhouse with a thatched roof. It's going to rain a lot because we're in Britain in the Iron Age. The weather still won't be particularly good. And that constant dripping from the roof forms basically a drip gully, and it kind of acts almost as its own kind of guttering there. So it's really important, and that's a kind of an integral feature we find in the construction of roundhouses. So on this site, you can see how numerous they are going across that image there, with some of the ring ditches, so the roundhouses, surviving better than the others. So you may find that some of them are just C-shapes, whereas others are far more complete circles. Oddly, or more usually in fact, there is an absence of internal features such as hearths, structural post holes and floor surfaces. So that can seem strange for such a definitive sign of settlement. However, it's actually quite characteristic for the region. Now, this does make some of the internal hearth elements or sort of internal pits that are found within Fosse, some of the structures there, quite interesting to compare. Now, unlike some of the other sites along the route that we've done where the assemblage can be quite sparse, and unlike Fosse, we actually know quite a bit about what their life was like here, and it's thanks to that artefactual and environmental evidence that we can paint a vibrant picture of daily life in this unique settlement as well. So the settlement is dated to the late Iron Age, so quite similar to Fosse, but actually it does span into the early Romano-British period. So we think from the assemblage around AD 25 to 100. So in use for just 75 years, and also bracketing the Roman invasion, this site has the potential to reveal what life was like at a time of great cultural and socio-political change. Now, it's mentioned that we did find the human bones in that roundhouse, so we need to think about why that's happening. So perhaps if it was Roman invaders, they wished to prove their ownership of the land by interring their dead, or alternatively, if it's a reaction from a farming settlement invaded by new cultures, changing their way of life, changing the way they build things, all those straight roads instead of wobbling ones, they might be attempting to assert a connection back to their old ways and that older way of kind of revering the dead. In either case, we can see the act of including the dead in the roots of your home as a departure from that kind of transient, low occupation, low density lifestyle that we saw during the earlier periods in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. So set against a rural backdrop, this practice may be linked to the sense of tethering communities to the land and to the plough. Now, in the final site, which we'll look at, is Mercote Marsh. And on this site, unfortunately, no fragments of human bone were found. However, the narrative of Iron Age people managing the landscape for farming and agriculture is further reinforced here. So what can we see in this picture of Mercote Marsh? It's different already in that we know, well, we can spot immediately that it's not muddy. So the archaeologists are quite lucky as they've had perhaps the better digging week. But as we can, it's worth pointing out, is that we have signs of ditches there running across. So where you might be able to catch along the sort of centre line going horizontally across the middle of the image, that's a big ditch. And then we have another one going back in the background as well. Yeah, brilliant. So hopefully now we can point out the different colours between the natural geology, which is that red, and then that kind of grey-brown colour of the fill of the features. Okay, so let's have a closer look then. So Mercote Marsh is a enclosed Iron Age rural settlement. It has associated interior features, so some things are happening within sort of the enclosed parts of it. The exterior fill system dates to the to the north and to the east, is dated to the late Iron Age period, and the settlement is unlikely to be later than the 2nd century AD. So what's really important that we can look at is that through Fosse, Mercote Marsh, and also Covington Woods, we're building up sites in the region that have evidence for communities or settlements focusing on farming and agriculture in the Iron Age period.
So there's quite a lot going on in this map, Emma. I wonder if you could help me break it down.
Yeah, it's pretty intense, isn't it? So that's why the maps often have those really good colour keys. It kind of brings your eye in a little bit quicker. So probably the thing that strikes everyone's eye most might be the kind of structured rectangular features. That's nothing archaeological, but it might be in a few hundred years' time, but those are the trenches that AOC, part of Connect, have dug in the earlier phase of excavation. So when we read this map, we need to discount the things that we've done as modern archaeologists. Either they help us reveal the past, when we want to find out those features, let's discard those trenches. Now, the next thing we can look at is perhaps the most recent thing, is the pink lines going across. So those pink lines are post-medieval ditches. Now, we can get that date either through pottery evidence, but sometimes we do find they actually link up to old maps of the area. So we can look at old Ordnance Survey maps or town plans, or if it's a site like Coldshill, which you can learn more about tomorrow, we'll see that some of the maps are drawn of the landscape, and the field names can help give indications of what those parts of land were used for in the past. But we can also look at the brown colours. So more towards the left-hand side, we've got that kind of that brown. Yep, that's it. That brown back to front L shape. So it's actually an Iron Age ditch, and it's these kind of brown colours that start to form our plan of what the site was like during the Iron Age period. Brilliant. So now we're going to have a bit more of a closer look about some of the features we've got on site. So Tash, with the new powers of deduction, reading archaeological features, could you point out to me the unexcavated half of the pit and the left-hand picture? Or is this too tricky?
You're putting me on the spot here, Emma. I think it's this big hole here.
Yeah, so that's the side that the archaeologist has taken out, and what we'll do then is read the section to try and discern how those fill deposits occur, and then the side that they've left in, yeah, brilliant. See, Tash has got it. I will bring her out to the field in no time. So yeah, that grey half that you can see, that's unexcavated, and then the big hole is the side that we've taken out ourselves to try and read the features and discerning what's happening. Now, some of the other features that were involved at Mercote Marsh was a cluster of pits in the central area. So this image on the right there, we've got a cluster of pits, and pit clusters are always quite tantalising for an archaeologist, as they're all in one place. So once you've kind of dug a few of them, you can really get an impact of the landscape and what they're doing there with those pits. We also need to consider what the purpose of those pits potentially might be. So if we were to find large assemblages of pottery and perhaps animal bone that's had butchery signs of it, we might infer that it could be a rubbish pit or a refuse pit. Or sometimes those pits might be forming shapes and features, so potentially they could be post holes. Or as often is the case, we still don't know. So we need to look then for finds and environmental evidence to help give us an idea of what's going on. Now, we've got a bit more information on the finds. Isn't that right, Helen?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, Helen? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna very quickly switch over my camera because I'm going to be showing you the finds cam, and what you're going to see.
Exciting.
Yes, it is. What you're going to see is you'll continue to see the image on the screen, but in addition, you're going to be seeing where my face was. You can now see a moving camera, and that's going to allow me to show you some of the finds really close up. So the first finds I'm just going to briefly show you are two pieces of worked flint found at the Iron Age settlement at Fosse, and that the worked stone from that site, the flint, was assessed by John Cotton. And John has been able to date and identify these two pieces of worked flint. As Emma mentioned earlier, they both date to the late Mesolithic or early Neolithic periods, making them thousands of years older than the settlement there. So really just demonstrating the longevity of activity in that landscape. So this one here is called a core trimming flake, and it would have once belonged to a core. That's a large nodule of flint from which smaller flakes are struck off to create tools. And this flake itself was then struck from the core in order to create a nice, flat, neat working surface. So this is actually kind of flint working waste, I guess. You can see where I'm turning it on the camera, those grooves running down the middle are where smaller flakes would have been struck from it originally. So that's a core trimming flake, as identified by John Cotton. And then the second example I've got over here, this is a smaller sort of narrow flake or blade, again of the same date as the core trimming flake. And if Natasha could move the slide along, please, then we can see a photo of that one as well. That's great, thank you. And what John identified on this one was that there's a little bit of use wear around the sharp cutting edge, which shows that it had been used during its lifetime, which is really lovely. So I don't think you're going to be able to spot it on here because it really is very fine use wear, but it's definitely there.
Absolutely beautiful.
Right, I'm going to switch the camera back over now.
Have you got some other finds to show us as well, Helen?
I have some of the pottery from Fosse and the quern as well, which I think I'm going to show when the slide with the photos on pops up.
Cool.
Yeah.
One of the other things we also found was this lovely mouse mandible. So Helen, could you take us through what finding a mouse mandible might suggest on site?
So the mouse mandible is amazing. It's, as you can imagine, really tiny. And I think this one was recovered from an environmental sample rather than being excavated by hand, because of its really small size. So we know that people in Iron Age Britain were farming arable crops as well as livestock, and they were storing grain and other foodstuffs on site, sometimes in big pits, big storage pits, sometimes in vessels and specialist storage structures. So there would have been a whole range of foodstuffs available, creating a perfect opportunity for mice to come along and take advantage. The first recorded example of the Western house mouse in Britain dates back to the late Bronze Age. So we know that by the time Fosse and Mercote Marsh were occupied, mice were part of that settled life in Britain, inhabiting human settlements where they'd have a really rich food source. So yeah, that's that. I think the mouse would have been doing much as it would be doing in our houses today, to be honest.
I think that connection to the past is quite important, because often we can look at a mouse mandible and oh, it's just a mouse, but by, as Helen said, connecting it into that past and those earlier landscapes, really start to kind of have the connection to those people, saying like we would also be suffering from the mud, from some mice, and perhaps the rain. So there's kind of instantly a sort of a tangibility to it as well. So environmental evidence plays a huge part in kind of evoking that tangible nature of history. And one of them that we found on quite a few sites is examples of charred hazelnut shells. So hazelnuts can really be easily shelled. You don't need to fire them. So one of the ideas that we like to discuss within archaeology as a wider discipline is why are they burning these hazelnut shells? So I believe Tash, you've set up a little poll, so if the audience might be able to help us decide on some answers.
Yeah, so we thought we'd ask all of you lot to see what you think. So I will launch this poll. The image will go off your screen for a second, so the poll will take over, but it's multiple choice, so just choose one of them and we'll see what the favourite is. So do you think they were burning hazelnuts because they were maybe cooking them, or because they were just putting fuel onto the fire, so like just throwing the shells onto the fire? Or do you think it was unintentional, maybe it just happened later? So we've got a bit of a split so far, but we do have a clear winner. Let the last few people vote, and then I'll reveal the answer. So about 60% of people think it was fueling fires, and then 34% think it might have been cooking.
Brilliant. Well, congratulations. There's actually no wrong answer. So debate is still out as to why it's happening, and you can certainly imagine if they're eating some of the nuts and then spitting out the shells, probably going to be sitting around the fire where it's warm. So why wouldn't you throw it down? You might have a mice problem as well, if you don't want to encourage them. So all those things kind of help us get an idea of what's going on. But you can sort of imagine them sort of sitting back, and it's a bit like sitting in a pub, isn't it? So you're eating nuts and perhaps drinking a beer. Now, if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that this beer link isn't that tenuous. So one of the things we do find on site as well is hulled barley. So barley can be used for fermentation and for brewing alcohol, but it can also be used as a milled down for flour. We do have some evidence along the sites for it being milled down. So Helen mentioned a quernstone, and we'll go into that a little bit later. However, should we go on to those finds now with Helen? Actually, no, we've got something else, haven't we? Brilliant. So this is perhaps our next test, which is what animal is this? So Helen, do you want to sort of take us through some of the bones of what we can see on this slide and the next?
Absolutely. So the bones from this animal, again assessed by Matilda Holmes. This animal is represented by something called the radio ulna. Now, in humans, you have the radius and the ulna, and those two bones make up your forearm. In this particular animal, they're actually fused together as one, and then they join up to the humerus, which is your upper arm bone. And in these images, you can see a little bit of that radio ulna and a little bit of the humerus. And I think if we go on to the next slide, I hope that won't give it away. No, it doesn't. Good. We can see from the same animal the left-hand side and the right-hand side of its pelvis as well. So you can see, if you've ever looked at a picture of a human skeleton, you can see that this animal is very much has a very different anatomy, and it's obviously pretty tiny as well. You can see from the scale.
Yeah, you can see it's very, very boned. So this animal probably doesn't have rickets. It's actually designed to be this way. It's also worth pointing out that it's extremely small, isn't it? It's a very tiny animal.
So now everyone's had a good look at these pictures, because they will go off your screen when I launch the poll. I will again launch the poll and hand it over to you. So multiple choice, do you think it's a rat, a frog, a mole, or a hedgehog? Gone poll mad in this webinar. So this is quite a split. This would be anyone's nightmare on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So I think quite a lot of people have voted, so I'll close that now. But the results are pretty evenly spread. So 22 rat, 25% frog, 30% mole, and 23% hedgehog. So the mole has just won, followed by the frog at 25%.
Amazing. So we can actually reveal that this animal is a frog. So if you just go on to the next slide, please, Tash.
Well done if you guessed that one. Or
Yeah,
if you knew.
quite a hard one. Amazing. So yeah, this is the frog, and we can see highlighted here on this drawing the different parts of the skeleton that Helen was talking about. The frog was found within the drip gully of the roundhouse. So we think what we know about frogs, they like things to be kind of moist, damp areas, and we know that the site is quite prone to being quite muddy and quite wet because of the clay as well. So the frog probably had quite a nice time living there until it met some sort of end. We don't know how that frog died, but it's really interesting to see how it tells us about the wider habitat of the area as well. So when we find animal bones like frogs and mice, we can build up an idea of what the habitat was like. We can get evidence of seeds, grain, and even pollen to provide further information of how the past actually looked like. So archaeological features can reveal the shape of the past, and the finds and environmental evidence, you can go so far as telling us what it smelt like. So the next image we're going to show you is of Fosse, but not as you know it. So that frog has come back to life. I'm not sure for how long, as it is being squeezed quite excitedly by a child right in the foreground. So this is a reconstruction of Fosse. We can pick out those rather naughty goats that I was thinking about earlier surrounding the enclosure. That fence is doing a good job for now, but they look like they might be quite determined. We can also pick out from this the entrance to structure 2. So this is the roundhouse where we found the human bone in the gully there. We can see that within the interior of the roundhouse there is a hearth, and there's someone actually sweeping out those hearth remains into the wider area of the settlement. So if we find things like a concentration of charcoal or a disbursement of charcoal, that helps reinforce what those interior structures that don't often survive may have been doing within that roundhouse itself. We can also see there is a lady out at the front, and we've got these 2 lovely big posts coming up with that beam going across and 2 kind of goat heads. So we're trying to allude here is some of the more common everyday rituals that we might encounter in this period. She's also cooking and preparing food. She may even be getting some goat milk as well. Now, if you can bring your eye further now into the background, you can see again that kind of like rugby football post, that sort of back gateway there. And then you'll just see the beams coming in of structure 1. So structure 1, if you can recall from the earlier reconstruction, was that lower, wider shape. So what we're trying to conjure here and give an idea is that when we find archaeological features on site, just because we found it in one dig doesn't necessarily mean it was all there at the same time. There are different phases to the occupation, and even a settlement with such a concentrated lifetime as this would still have had different phases to it. So we think it's likely that that structure 1 rather had different phases to it, and there's nothing that would say that one roundhouse was built at exactly the same time as another. So much like in modern housing developments, where you'll get a cluster of houses built first, and if you go further around the estate and building site, you'll see some houses being built. So roundhouses have a limited shelf life, and you might have one in a state of disrepair whilst you've got your current one to live in.
Thank you. Just looking at the clock, and the time is flying by, so I'm aware that we've got quite a lot of questions. So I'll go over to Helen for the final finds, and we've got you some 3D models to show on Sketchfab as well, and then we will go to questions.
Lovely, thank you, Natasha. So some of our colleagues at AOC Archaeology have produced some really brilliant 3D digital images of a few of finds from Fosse and Mercote Marsh Farm. This is an example. This vessel is represented by just one sherd. You can see it's one sherd from the very rim of the vessel, and this one's from Fosse. The pottery assemblage from this site was examined by Phil Mills, and Phil was able to look at that single sherd and suggest that it was from a really large large possible cauldron or bowl, and he's actually suggested that could be indicative of communal cooking and communal eating. So I think that said something really nice about the kind of social life at the site at Fosse.
I'll just say these models are on a site called Sketchfab, and I think a lot of archaeological companies use Sketchfab to put 3D models so the public can see them. So do have a look online at Sketchfab.
Now, shall I just say something about this particular sherd that was on screen, or are you going to show another model?
I think we'll just show the one model today.
Cool. Okay, well in that case, I'll say something about the sherd that's on screen at the moment. This one was identified by Phil Mills as possibly being a sherd of something called scordware. That's a type of Iron Age pottery which is decorated in lots of very fine scored lines, and it's commonly found in the East Midlands. So the fact that it's appearing at Fosse suggests that it might have been kind of exchanged or traded at some point, and there's a possibility it might have arrived to the site possibly on the riverways. Has been a suggestion. So that's just a nice illustration of the kind of trade and exchange that might be taking place.
And at this point, I have another poll for everyone about broken pottery and why pottery was being broken by Iron Age people. So I'll launch that, and then Helen can tell you a bit more about why they might have been breaking pottery. This is the final poll where I'll be quizzing you. So I will launch that poll now, and again, it's multiple choice. So why do you think the Iron Age people were breaking pottery up? The ritual reasons, to repurpose objects, or was it accidental damage? Give everyone a few more seconds. Again, we have a clear winner for this one. So I can reveal that 66% of people think it was accidental breakage, and only 22% think it was repurposing the objects, and only 12% think it will have been for ritual purposes. Can you give us any more information, Helen?
Yeah, of course. So this is a bit of a cheat answer, I think, but I think all three of those things are correct. Of course, Iron Age pottery is sometimes fairly soft and quite easily broken, and pots certainly would have broken accidentally on a day-to-day basis, I'm sure. I think there are some possible examples, not from these sites, but from wider Iron Age archaeology, of maybe pots being deliberately broken, or at least of the fragments being very deliberately placed into deposits, suggesting that there's a little bit more going on than just kind of disposal. And in terms of repurposing, pots are sometimes ground down to create a sort of powdered product called grog, which is then sometimes incorporated into clay to make new pots. So that's a nice way of kind of pots kind of living on in new pots as grog. So yeah, it's certainly a complex picture going on there.
Wonderful. We've got 5 minutes left, so we will skip now to questions. So I know I've already got quite a few questions to get through, but if anyone else wants to ask a question, here is your chance. So if I go back to the beginning, the first question was on site conditions and weather affecting excavations. Emma, can it be too wet to continue?
Yeah, it can, and the geology of the landscape can really affect things. Sometimes a site can be beautifully well draining, and it can absolutely rain down. You think, brilliant, I sort of feel a little bit more refreshed whilst I'm digging this huge ditch, and it doesn't affect it whatsoever. However, on some sites, particularly where you may have more delicate features, or what we perhaps might call more ephemeral, so they're even harder to see, as they're often associated perhaps with more prehistoric landscapes, that rain can really affect it. Because imagine you've got, I don't know, 5 people on site walking about in boots and big safety boots. It gets muddier and muddier and muddier, and you get kind of what we refer to as moon boots, so where your shoes just become huge with big flags of mud. That will be no good walking along a delicate site. So each site is individual, but we do actually call it. If the weather is too bad, we'll call it.
I'm sure anyone who's been to a music festival will be well aware what you mean by moon shoes. Just to say, the site was in Staffordshire, to everyone who's asking for where it is. A question on the settlements. Were the settlements set in forested areas or more open landscapes?
Okay, so at this point in time, we are seeing in the Mesolithic period, we're seeing small bits of land being cleared. However, this increases, this land clearance, this starting of woodland increases. By the time we get to the Iron Age period, they've actually felled areas of woodland in order for them to kind of make camp. But it's not really making camp. They're actually starting to get more tethered roots in the area and landscape. So during those earlier prehistoric periods, they're moving through, got that hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and then they think, actually, this is actually quite difficult. If I stay here, put down roots, I can start farming crops. I can perhaps, I don't know, I can grow things to make mill and flour and barley, all those sorts of things. So by the Iron Age, we are seeing that movement away from that transitory nature, and they're making settlement routes. The landscape is cleared of trees in order to supplement that farming space that's so desperately required.
And then a question on what happens to the objects. So someone's asking, after they've been kind of photographed and catalogued, what happens to them and how do we record all these finds? Do we keep a register or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first things that happens to finds when they come back into the office from the field is that they'll be firstly washed, and then after they've dried off, they'll be placed into a big spreadsheet and bagged appropriately and labelled, and that's kind of step one towards getting them assessed. There's then a process of kind of assessment that happens, where we send them off to find specialists. So I mentioned a few of our find specialists during this webinar, and then there's a chance for those specialists to suggest further research that needs to be done on the finds assemblages. And once that research has happened, it's then time for the finds to be deposited in a museum at the very end of the project, once everything's been finished. So yes, they will end up in local museums and collections, and that's their kind of end point for them.
Brilliant, thank you. right at the beginning of the webinar, Emma, I think you mentioned that they would leave bodies out to kind of rot away. Would that be right outside their houses? Would that be in a separate area? And how long would they leave them for?
Okay, so this is called excarnation, and Helen was discussing it. So I'm not too full with all the facts of this. I'm going to pass this over to Helen and see what she knows.
Well, it's an interesting one, really, because it's a process that wouldn't necessarily leave behind any archaeological evidence at all. So it's not been proven that this is happening in Iron Age Britain, but it's sort of a theory, I guess, because we have so little evidence of formalized kind of graves and cemeteries. We know that people are doing something with their deceased, but there's very much a debate about exactly what that might have been. So excarnation is one possibility, but there are lots of others as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And one more follow-up question on depositing finds with local museums. Someone's asked whether we send other material with it. So do we send the reports and images and stuff along with the finds to the museum? Is that what happens, Helen?
Yeah, so the each site, each project will have an archive that encompasses all of those records, and that will all be safely deposited at the end of the project.
And then one more question, running out of time. So did we find any other tree species at Cubbington Woods? Do we know of, Emma?
Yeah, so we had oak. What else we had? Oak. I think there was some birch as well. I forget the other ones. I think yes. So oak was the main one. Oak was quite ubiquitous. So finding examples of oak isn't like exciting. It just kind of says it's a widespread tree during that period. Some of the other plants that we found were lady's bedstraw, so Gallium verum. I really like lady's bedstraw, and you might hear me mention it in all the webinars that we do. I'm a big fan of this weed. It smells like hay. It's got lovely yellow frothy flowers. Lady's bedstraw is also referenced in the Canterbury Tales. So it's lovely flower when it kind of pops up through archaeological sites. I think it just kind of it invokes its presence throughout history. So I like that we can chart sort of the history of a plant through archaeological results and Chaucer.
I think in the reconstruction image we showed earlier, all the plants and different species in that have all been based on archaeological evidence.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Tash. Yeah, so as we were saying kind of throughout, those little seeds, those grains, those bits of barley, all of that brings and comes together within the reconstruction. So the graphic studio will look quite closely at the environmental report in order to build up the picture of what's actually growing there, but also supplement it with the details from the survey. So where we shoot everything in using a GPS. So yeah, you're quite right. So all the trees that you could see in that reconstruction are based on the environmental remains or wider established research goals there.
And final question: have we been able to detect any Iron Age settlement at Fosse, and can we connect this to other places, and maybe including Roman roads that were built? So how can we kind of start building up a picture by connecting all these places?
That's a really, really good question. So along the route of HS2, we have we've got an incredible amount of research aims. We call these the HERDS objectives. You can actually go online, so it's HERDS. So the HERDS objectives, you can Google them and find a full kind of list of what our historic environmental research directives are for the region. One of them is looking at kind of that transition from the Iron Age to the Rhino-British period. So when we write our reports, so Covington Woods is a Wessex site, yet Fosse is AOC part of Connect, we'll both contribute to that research objective So then when it is kind of deposited into the museum, so the broader surface, more research can be undertaken, and they'll have all the documentary evidence and the site evidence they need to build that up. But certainly so far, we've not taken that part of research yet as part of our reporting, but we can kind of make inferences that they might be linked as part of a wider landscape, because we are seeing those similarities in kind of form, function, treatment of the dead. Also the proximity between Fosse and Covington Woods is about 6 kilometres as the crow flies. So you could walk there in an afternoon quite easily. So those sorts of things do suggest that yes, there is certainly further work to be done to connect those sites and those landscapes.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining me and answering those questions, Emma and Helen. That's really helpful. I can see that the other questions, Sam, my colleague in the background, has also been fantastic at going through and answering some of your questions. So I think between us, we should have at least touched or answered all your questions so far. So just a final slide, which is just to say thank you for watching. So I will close that, and one last time say thank you for joining us, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.